How's it going, folks? Kish Yardy Gaming Nation, or Kish Yardy Nation Gaming, right? Um, like, share, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. This content right here, it inspired, when I say white Christian men blame Jews for slavery to dodge accountability. Um, this inspired me because listening to a lot of Twitter spaces and a lot of white men in these Twitter spaces, they like to deflect their role in slavery when it came to the destruction of the black community, when it came to um, buying the slaves, buying African slaves, and then bringing them over here into Americas, into the Caribbean, and then into North America, and doing what they did, right? And oftentimes now, whenever you hold them accountable and you present the facts to them, they always like to scapegoat and blame the Jews, right? This is something they like doing. Now we know where black women get that trait from, right? They get it from their white slave masters. Like they learn not to take accountability and these things and that there. But this is not about black women. This is about white Christian men that like to blame the Jews for everything, right? So in today's recording or in today's video, we're gonna break these suckers down. You feel me? How white Christian men love to blame the Jews, right? The truth, the Confederate Army. This is one of the talking points, right? Which was I knew was a lie that I've heard, right? That the Confederate Army was racially integrated, which was bullshit. Who's gonna believe that, right? The Confederate States Army was not racially integrated in any formal or structured way. The South was fighting to preserve slavery, and the racial caste system, its laws and military structure reflected that. Black men were not allowed to serve as combat soldiers in the Confederate Army for nearly the entire war. So, where does the myth come from? This claim usually comes from Confederate apologists or people trying to downplay the racial dynamics of the Civil War. Here's my fault. Here's how they twist the facts. Black Confederate soldier myths. It's true that some enslaved black men were present with the Confederate Army, but as slaves, not as soldiers. They were cooks, body servants, laborers, teamsters, etc., not armed combat troops. These men were forced into service or along with enslaved by or brought along by enslavers. Late war desperation. In March 1865, a month before the war ended, the Confederate Congress authorized the enlistment of black men as soldiers, but only if they were freed first. This was extremely controversial even within the South. Only a tiny number were actually recruited, and almost none saw combat, right? So you got to understand, white people tell half truths. They don't tell the full scope of the things. They just said, well, the Confederate War was the Confederate black was integrated, and black men fought, or black men were integrated into the Confederate Army. They don't break down if they were combat roles or they were in more cooks and servant or laborer roles. You see what I'm saying? The Union Army truly integrated by comparison. While the Union was not perfectly equalitarian, it had over 180,000 black soldiers in segregated but official regiments, U.S. colored troops. These men fought in major battles and played a decisive role in the Union victory. Right? Conclusion: the Confederate Army was not integrated. Claims that it was are part of a modern revisionist narrative meant to obscure the Confederacy's defense of slavery and white supremacy. Now, did some Jews participate in slavery? Yes, but on a small scale. Right? So this is me getting into them blaming the Jews about that how the a transatlantic slave trade, and then them saying how the Jews dominated that and this, that, and the third, right? Yes, but on some small scale. On far less Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, in both the transatlantic slave trade and American slavery, a small number of Jews were involved as slave owners, traders, and financiers. However, they were a tiny minority among the much larger number of non-Jewish European slave owners, traders, and beneficiaries of slavery. What are the numbers? In the American South, in places like Charleston, South Carolina, in Savannah, Georgia, Jewish communities existed and some Jewish families did own slaves. According to historian L. Faber, who did comprehensive study, in the antebellum South, no more than 1.25% of all slaveholders were Jewish. The majority of Jews in the South were merchants, shopkeepers, and not large plantation owners. In the transatlantic slave trade, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, an academic source, the vast majority of ships were owned and operated by European Christian nations: Portugal, Britain, France, Spain, and Netherlands. So, to the white racist people online, you telling me all of those were Jewish? All right. A very small number of Jewish merchants and financiers were in places like the Netherlands, Brazil, or the Caribbean were indirectly involved, but they did not dominate the trade. In fact, most of the slave ships were state-sponsored or backed by major Christian monarchies and companies like the Royal African Company, the Dutch West India Company, and the Portuguese Crown. So unless you're telling me all of these were Jewish things, white people, white races, all right? Key scholarly sources. L. Faber, Jew slaves and the slave trade found no evidence that the Jews dominated or even significantly controlled the trade. David Bryan Davis, in Human Bondage, one of the most respected historians of slavery, concluded Jewish involvement was marginal compared to Christian Europe. Seymour Drescher, about what? I don't even know how to say this name. A History of Slavery and Anti-Slavery agrees that Jewish involvement was minor, right? So I'm giving you the sources, right? Honest conclusion. Some Jews owned slaves and a few participated in slave trading. No, they were not major players in the transatlantic slave trade or in the overall institution of slavery. The vast majority of slave owners, shippers, and political backers were Christian Europeans and Americans. So these are the books: L. Faber, Jews and Slavery. Summary: a rigorous statistical and documentary analysis of Jewish involvement in the slave trade. Key findings: Jewish participation was minor and not statistically significant when compared to Christian involvement. Why it matters: directly rebuts claims made in a secret relationship between blacks and Jews. That's the book that the Nation of Islam put out, right? David Bryan Davis in Human Bondage: The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World. One of the most respected historians of slavery in the Western world. Key findings: Jewish merchants were not dominant. Slavery was primarily supported and expanded by Christian empires. Insight: places slavery within the broader Western capitalist colonial context. Right. See, now I preach capitalism on my channel, right? See, this is the problem, right? When you have Western capitalism doing things they're not supposed to be doing, and then it makes it easy for a Marxist to go, well, this is, to go to black people and be like, yo, capitalism is bad, this and that, because of the sins that it committed, right? Which wasn't supposed to be. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that capitalism is the best for black people. Just don't do slavery and don't have racism, right? Seymour Drescher, abolishing. A History of Slavery and Anti. I want to also point out, communism is more slavery than capitalism, right? Because communism is where a central group of people or power is dictating how the society or the culture is to be ran, right? That's just more in parallel to a slave plantation where the central power is the big house or the white man, right? And he's telling the slaves, the black people or whoever's enslaved, how to eat, how to fuck, how to breed, and those things, right? So communism is more aligned with slavery than capitalism, right? Key findings: Jewish participation was minuscule in the broader European colonies, right? Slave system. Focus emphasizes the mass scale of Christian empire, European involvement, England, Portugal, Spain, France, etc. Henry Louis Gates Jr., various essays and interviews, Black Harvard scholar who has addressed this myth directly. While it's true that some Jews were involved in the slave trade, to say that Jews played a dominant role in the Atlantic slave trade is simply false. The truth is that the Jews accounted for a tiny minority of the slave owners and traders. Gates' rebuttal appears in the Root article, Ending the Slavery Blame Game. His PBS work, African American Lives, the African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, right? So I'm giving you the sources. Jonathan, Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World, 2004, explores interaction between Jews and Blacks in the Atlantic slave world. It affirms that Jews were never central players in slavery, especially compared to European empires, right? The Jewish population of the United States in the 19th century contains the demographic data about Jewish community shows that Jews made up less than 1% of the U.S. population during the slavery era, limiting any significant impact. So white people, you got to explain to me how 1% dominated the slave trade and you were the bigger group, right? Peer-reviewed journal articles, Jews and the American Slave Trade, American Jewish Historical Quarterly, refutes myths with detailed records and census data. Shows Jewish slave ownership mirrored or was below average compared to non-Jews. Jews, Slavery, and the Slave Trade, a historical review journal of the Negro History, now the Journal of African American History. Objective overview of Black Jewish relations in the context of slavery. Summary data. Did some Jews own slaves? Yes, especially in the South, but in small numbers. Did Jews dominate the slave trade, Dutch, etc.? Did this slave trade? No. Dutch, etc. ran the slave trade. No, this is a myth. Christian, British, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch, etc. ran the slave trade. Were Jews involved in shipping slaves from Africa? Very rarely. Jewish involvement was minimal and peripheral. In this historical settled issue, among credible scholars, yes. All right. Caribbean laws. So this is important. This is important, right? Caribbean laws and restrictions on Jews owning slaves and plantations. Dutch and British colonial laws. So this is Dutch and British colonial laws. Unless you're telling me the Dutch and the British are Jewish too, right? In colonies like Suriname, Carico, Barbados, and Jamaica, Jews are often barred or restricted from owning large plantations, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. For example, in Barbados, a 1668 law restricted Jews from owning more than 2 slaves per household, and mostly only for domestic or business merchant purposes. So mind you, this exposes one thing, a couple things about you white people. A, you're lying if you say you couldn't tell the difference between a Jewish person and a regular white person. If you're passing laws to restrict them from having large plantations, having Jews owning large plantations. So you was able to tell the difference. Right? B, if you're going to tell me that the Dutch and the British were Jewish, right? That means that the Dutch and British were not European Christians. The Dutch and the British were Jewish people. That's the only way this logic works out. If you're telling me that the Jews brought over the slaves, dominated the slave trade, and they ran the damn thing. So then who's the Dutch and the British passing colonial laws? They must be Jewish too, right? These laws reflected racial and religious hierarchies, where Jews were tolerated but denied the full privileges of white Christian planters. So right there is saying they could tell the difference between the Jews, and white Christian planters. It's giving you a distinction. In Dutch colonies like Suriname, Jews had a bit more freedom. Some did eventually own plantation, but this was still limited relative to their Christian neighbors, right? Key historical notes. Jews were primarily merchants, traders, money lenders, or artisans, not plantation magnates, right? In places where Jews were allowed more freedom, like Dutch-controlled Suriname, a small minority of Sephardic Jews became relatively prosperous and owned some enslaved Africans, but again, this was not the norm and never represented a major share of the planter elite. Most Jewish slaveholders had 1 to 3 slaves, often for store work, domestic service, or transportation, not for mass sugar or cotton production. Right? Sources reference. Jonathan, I don't know how to say his last name. Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World details the largest restriction placed on Jews in various Caribbean colonies. L. Faber, Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade, notes that Jewish participation in plantation slavery was marginal at best, especially in places like Barbados and Jamaica. Jacob Rader Marcus, the Colonial American Jew, discusses Caribbean Jewish life and the discriminatory policies they face. Mind you, white men, you're lying when you said you could not tell the difference between the Jewish and the white person. So there was no way for them to infiltrate you unless you allowed that to happen, because you didn't allow this to happen here, and somehow you allowed it to happen there. in America, which makes you the dumbest human being possible, right? Because at least when you could say about Africans getting overthrown, you had used a military force to fight to go to war with Africa or go to Africa and take slaves over from over there. The Jews, they were 1% of the population, 1%, and you allowed this 1% who you was able to tell the difference between at a time to infiltrate America and take over your country. You got to be a pretty stupid individual for you to allow that to happen. Why these laws existed? Religious discrimination. Jews were seen as religious outsiders and not trustworthy to be part of the colonial elite. Woo! Racial control. European colonial authorities feared too many minorities owning black people could weaken white dominance. Woo! Economic competition. Jewish merchants were often very successful in trade, which made them targets of resentment by Christian planters. Wow. So you were able to tell the difference, right? Summary. Point. Y'all can read this on, pause the video and read that on your own, right? So bottom line, you Jewish people, you white men, Christian men, you gotta be a dumb individual if you allow that 1% to dominate over you and take over your shit. And you're lying when you're saying that the Jews dominated the entire slave trade. If you're gonna that means that Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, all these places were Jewish ran. All right. The myth of the Jewish domination in the slave trade. Point one. One of the biggest lies, white racists love to push is that Jews dominated the transatlantic slave trade. That's just historically false and easily debunked if you're honest with the records. In many colonial territories like Barbados in the Caribbean, Jews were legally restricted from owning large plantations or mass numbers of enslaved Africans. In fact, in Barbados, they were limited to just one or two slaves, and usually only for merchant or household work, not for agricultural profit like the white Christian planter class. The colonial mindset was clear. We can't let minorities out-own us in wealth or power. Now let's talk about who did dominate slavery. It was Christian-run European state-sponsored companies like the Royal African, the Dutch West India Company, the Portuguese Crown, and the Spanish Catholic trading monopolies. These weren't Jewish companies. They were Christian imperial systems backed by popes, kings, and corporations, not rabbis or merchants. So when white folks start pointing fingers at Jews to dodge the responsibility, they're not telling the history, they're just rewriting it. So, unless you're telling me all those companies were Jewish, then I would agree with you that the Jews dominated slavery, and they were the one that was slave trading, right? But then again, just like the cave beasts that white people are, you like to lie. All right? You can take the time to pause the video. You can look at this if you want. Fact check, breakdown, right? Point two, West Africans sold slaves, but who set the rules? Yes, West Africans sold slaves during the transatlantic slave trade. That's fact. We shouldn't run from it, but let's not stop there. Who set the rules? Who created the system? Who decided how brutal it would be once those Africans were shipped across the ocean? The answer is European Christians running state-backed operations like the Royal African Company didn't have to buy slaves. They chose to. So the argument, well, West Africans sold slaves. Who did they sell the slaves to? And why did you buy the slaves from? Why did who they sold the slaves to buy slaves? Right? It's the old supply and demand model, right? You supply, what's the demand? I can guarantee you if the Royal African Company was in the market for sugar or in the market for rice or in the market for jewels and diamonds, the West Africa would have sold you those things. But you were in the market for slaves, slave livestock at that. So what did they do? Sell you slaves, and you bought them. If it was morally unjust for West Africans to sell the slaves, it was morally unjust for you to buy them. Simple as that. They didn't have to treat African people like, so let me read this properly. The answer is European Christians running state-backed operations like the Royal African Company didn't have to buy slaves. They chose to. They didn't have to treat African people like livestock. They chose to. That's not on the West Africans. That's on the buyers, the system builders, and the so-called civilized Christian world. Remember, a lot of you white Christians were based on your how you ran things off the Bible and biblical stuff, right? Chosen people in these things, right? And you enslaved people, right? Let's talk about how brutal they were in Jamaica. For example, the average enslaved African only lived about 7 to 10 years. That's how deadly the sugar plantation system was. The work, the heat, and the torture. So what did European Christians do there? They didn't breed enslaved people, they replaced them. They treated black people as disposable, like tools, right? So you're telling me that those people were Jews too? Okay. Compare that to America, where the plantation system was based on breeding black people like livestock. This wasn't accidental, this was policy. Especially in the antebellum South, enslaved black women were often forced to reproduce, and families were torn apart to maintain a steady supply of labor. Now, I don't know if it was in the biography of Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington, where it was stated that when a black male buck or slave buck reached the age of 16, they just shipped them to a different plantation. You know what I'm saying? I forgot what biography I read that from, right? Oh, so these systems weren't Jewish systems. They were European Christian and capitalist. So when white racists tried to deflect by pointing to African involvement or blaming Jews, they're dodging their own legacy of terror. See now, white people, you have to take accountability for the sins you committed under the banner of capitalism and patriarchy. This is why the leftists can trick black people out of being patriarchal and trick black people from not engaging in capitalism because of what you did with those systems. Then y'all can pause it, and then you can you can pause the video, and you can look at the fact check breakdown, right? And you can go fact check these things yourself. Like you don't have to look on my video. Go do the research, right? Next slide. If Jews dominated slavery, then America belongs. So this is my logical punch to white people, right? That believe in this nonsense. If you said the Jews dominated slavery, right, then America belongs to the Jews. When white racists claim that Jews dominated slavery, they're making a wild admission without realizing it. Because if the Jews ran the slave trade, owned the majority of the plantations, and were responsible for enslaving and using black labor to build America, then guess what? America wouldn't belong to white Christians, it would belong to the Jews. That'll mean that the roads, the railroads, the cotton empire, the White House, and even the Caribbean sugar economy were built under Jewish control using black bodies. And if that's true, then white Christians are just historically bystanders, not the builders, not the owners. So you were complicit. You didn't do shit. You're just as much as a just like black people. You're just as much um as a tenant in the house called America by your logic. If you're telling me that the Jews dominated the slavery and everything else, right? That would mean so the next time the next time a white racist tells a black person to go back to Africa, we should say cool, but you go back to Europe because by your logic, this country belongs to the Jews who you say built it off our backs, right? Of course, that's not the real history, right? And we know that the truth is the European Christian empires, British, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and the French, unless you're telling me all these people are Jewish, built and ran the transatlantic slave system. They backed it with their churches, crowns, and companies. Jews were a tiny minority with legal restrictions in many places like Barbados and were often barred from owning land or large numbers of slaves. So when they scapegoat the Jews to dodge accountability, they either have to admit that they didn't build the country or own up to the fact that they did, and it was their Christian ancestors who did the enslaving, whipping, raping, and exploiting. Either way, they're in a corner, and that's where the truth puts them. Right? So what I did there is I put you in a trick bag or a box. And the only way out of it is to one, admit that the America belongs to the Jews, or admit that you were involved in slavery. Because you can't say that the Jews dominated slavery, which would mean that they owned the plantations, would mean that they used the black people to build up America, right? And then at the same to escape accountability, and then in the next breath, if we say that the Jews run America, you say no. So then, who bought the slaves? Who used black people to build up America? It's either the Christian white people used slaves to build up America, or it was the Jews. And if it was the Jews, that means America belongs to the Jews. Come on, white people. This is the fact check, right? If you want to give Jews credit for building America, then stop acting like this country belongs to you. But if you want to say white Christian built it, then stop blaming the Jews for your own atrocities. You're forcing them to pick between, we built this, so own the sins of the slavery and colonization. The Jews ran slavery, then this isn't your country either. You feel me? You can't go back. So when one person says go back to Africa, this is my counterpoint to them. You can't go back somewhere you were stolen from. When a white person says go back to Africa, they're ignoring one critical fact. Our ancestors didn't come here by choice. For me to go back to somewhere, that means that I came to the place I came to America voluntarily, right? We didn't get on a carnival cruise looking for a better life. We were kidnapped. We were captured, sold through a brutal slave system built by European Christian empires, and dragged across the Atlantic in chains. You can't tell someone to go back to a place they were forcibly removed from. That's not immigration, that's abduction. And even deeper than that, telling black people to go back to Africa isn't just ignorant, it's cruel. It erases the centuries of forced labor, rape, cultural erasure that our people endured while literally building the wealth, infrastructure, and power of the Americas. So let's flip it. You go back to Europe because we didn't ask to be here. You brought us here and then built your nations on our stolen labor. If we're guests, it was by force. If we're outsiders, then you're invaders. If black people are the outsiders, then you're the invaders, which means you don't belong in America either. You know what I'm saying? If we became a guest to America, it was by force. And then you can fact check this. All right. Part one: Jews domination myth. Jews didn't run slave trade, so these are the quick points right here. I'll pause that for a bit. You can look at this. Point two: you can look at this. All right. Point three: you can look at this. Point four: you can look at this. All right. Now, to end this video, white people, you are responsible for what happened to black people. Stop blaming everybody else. All right. Now, moving forward, I'm not making this video because I hate white people. I'm directing this specifically to white people with the same racist mentality or mindset that I hear in these Twitter spaces and on YouTube, right? Oftentimes. Because oftentimes what prevents black people from wanting to engage with white people is because of dishonesty of white people, right? They want to be dishonest. You know what I'm saying? And then telling black people to go back home. When you could go back home. This is not your line either, right? Come to find out, there were black people here in the Americas before Europeans got here. So I'm saying, so like, this is what makes it very easy for other groups of white people from the left or from the Marxists to trick black people into going against America, because you have white Americans that are racist that do things to black people and then want to admit that they're doing things to black people. And then when black people point it out and then show you the facts, like I'm showing you the facts, it gets ignored, or I get called monkey. You know what I'm saying? So, but anyway, this is Kiss Shorty Gaming Nation. Like, share, and subscribe.